G'day, friends and fans, and welcome to Dave Talk Stuff. All right, you knew if there's enough people on the live chat, I will put out a panel. If not, sayonara. But you'll know the reality. I think you've all realize, right? The feminism is the cause of the high cost of living. And I'm sure that most people have realized there's a dark, from my videos, of course, there is a dark side of feminism. And of course, it's all a deliberate trap, right? Longer hours, less income, less satisfaction, the constant grind. It's all by design. But the question remains, what is the trap? Well, first, it's the economic and work trap. Married men are increasingly working double shifts, having to produce dual incomes to meet the payroll. Then there's the activist trap. Feminists are drawn increasingly into more and more activism for more and more causes that actually draw more from everybody else's issues, desires, dreams for power. So more and more feminists are going from being in power to now being a tool of power, where they are just one of many intersectional groups, and all the other groups are now voting against them, whether it be trans, whether it be gay, whether they be even lesbians, or just simply people of color against expressing their hatred of white people. Feminists are now the enemy of many groups that they were once allied with. As I pointed out, this is the inevitable outcome of the game of power. For when you have more and more groups around the table, they will start working in conjunction against you for power that you once had or have. Now, many feminists are now falling into the trap where they have to work double shifts, where they need dual incomes just to survive on their own. And the so-called wage gap and wage slavery, well, they are now becoming victims of their own cost of living. And this all started with the dual income. Now, there's two types of dual incomers, right? There was the double income, 2 kids, right? They would buy up all the housing around schools. They would get the 2-car garage, 2 cars. They took all the top jobs. They lived the high life. But in order to fund their retirement, they had to sell their houses at even more than, say, the hyperinflated prices of the 80s and 90s. So they created the housing financial crisis of the 2000s. Early retirement expanded into not one, but 2 financial crises. So, and of course, the other group was the double income, no kids, and they bought up all the luxury apartments, and they took even higher income jobs and created enormous student debt, which today is pretty much subsidized by government, and the government has to come up with money to make up for their debt and fund these exorbitant daycare centers known as colleges. And of course, as you know, these colleges activist centers are nothing but toxic wastelands where perpetual butthurt activists pretty much waste their time and taxpayers' time with their endless wah sessions and destruction of society. But feminists are at a crossroads where they claim to be equal to men, but all men are trash. And of course, this is the dialectic. They have doublethink, two ideas completely opposite, getting further and further apart from each other, and they're being pulled in two different directions, unable to reconcile their beliefs. So that leaves many women now realizing that feminism has become anti-woman, anti-human, in fact, and is not just a lie, it's always been a lie. The feminist trap has always been a lie. What empowerment are you free from the whoops? What empowerment? What empowerment is there in feminism? Come on, you tell me, right? Are you free from the drudgery of working at home in the kitchen and in the laundry? No, you have no man. So, but you still have to do your laundry. You still have to cook your meals. You can't afford to eat out. Eventually, you join the ever-growing number of millennials who go bankrupt every year because they just order takeout and wonder why why their $4,000 a month income is useless because they're spending $3,500 and they're falling behind on their other obligations, and suddenly realizing they have 5,000 in obligations comes per month because they forgot to pay their taxes. Remember, a lot of these people are working double incomes for nothing, to go just to spend more money to go between. And of course, what social life they have is ever decreasing. They can't keep up with the Joneses, let alone the Jane Fondas of this world. But most of the average chicks are just trying to keep up with the weather girls' ever-changing outfits. This is the failure of women who, once upon a time, used to educate each other to avoid the consumer traps. But consumer traps have created a decline in happiness where you traded your happiness in a relationship, you have in your profession, in your personal life, your achievements in personal life, where you turned everything into a constant crybaby session where he doesn't help me with the cooking, where he doesn't help me with the laundry, where he doesn't help me with the baby, where he doesn't earn enough money, where are the good men? So all of a sudden, you have women who now suddenly realize that their collective political power is turning against them because they've educated. Girl power is now trans power, people of color power, and gay power, and Islamic power, and all the groups are shifting and bustling and pushing. More and more groups are pushing feminists to the sidelines, where most feminists and pussyhats can't even decry what actual equality they want. They have work, but now they're working two jobs, or they want universal income so they can be perpetually traveling the world like Belinda Gates, or Mackenzie Bezos. But they have billions of dollars. You don't. You want to be a perpetual activist, but you can't define your activism. Feminists cannot define what they want anymore. They talk about equity and all these ephemeral ideas, but they're all unicorns. Actually, it's more like they're a dog chasing a car. They know what to do when they catch it. They caught the car, and the car came with car keys, insurance, repair bills, uh, a cost of living, basically. So now you have every dog wanting a car. Well, basically, every feminist wanting a job. That costs society more and more money, right? Because more and more they want their safe government jobs. They want more and more school teachers. They want more and more government workers. They want more and more human resource departments. They want more and more customer service. They want more and more of everything except responsibility for their actions. And the problem is they increasingly want the cost of living dragged down while they're dragging the cost of living up. So girl power is just a slogan. It's an aesthetic trend. It does not have any actual underlying definitive destination. It is constant complaining. So feminists have fallen in a trap where they complain, they drive up the cost of living, they have to work longer hours, they complain more, they get older and older and older, and as their productivity decreases, they're unable to keep up. And now falling into the double income trap they created with their own bullshit. Now, the ideological trap and the cultural backlash. Naturally, people are realizing feminism is not the answer, it is not the solution, but the cause. People have gender fatigue. They're sick of women going on TikTok to complain about their menstruation, about their inability to find a boyfriend. When they do find a boyfriend, they complain about his income, his dick size, his lack of social awareness, his inability to satisfy her. It's a never-ending where. And then they go, where is he now? Why won't he come home? Why doesn't he want to spend time with me? Right? Women want a proverbial punching bag, right? They want power without responsibility. They want to beat you up, but then they expect you to come crawling back to them. So they want this perfect love, and to prove this perfect love, they constantly shit test you. It's all for shits and giggles. But ultimately, they've so polarized society that they've created backlash, exhaustion, feminism fatigue, not just amongst men, but amongst women. And many now argue that if you get rid of human resource, you want to cut the cost of living, you have to cut expenses, get rid of human resource departments, cut the number of school teachers. In fact, they look at it and say, look, 50 school teachers produced a 50% outcome, but 60 produced a 40%, and 70 produced a 30%. Now they want 80 school teachers per school or something, and that is definitely going to produce a much less outcome. So the more teachers a school has, the less outcomes there are for students. And more of these teachers are not even teachers, they are activists who spend their time talking about feminist issues, gay issues, lesbian issues, trans issues, the environment, and creating more and more fatigue. And students are clocking out. It is a never-ending wah. And the problem is the lack of pushback until modern times. Now, some people have their different theories about the goals of mgtow, the goals of feminism, the goals of men in general. Most of it is
right turn, Clyde.
because most people know this is what is the modern feminist view of marriage.
You like eating red carpet, tough guy?
Yes!
Say you like eating red carpet!
I like eating red carpet!
Giggity.
But more and more men are saying,
screw your feminism.
feminism can't even define itself. I can.
Emotional, damn it!
Exactly. And how should we deal with feminism? Ideally, But unfortunately, you can't even. So, until enough men.
Right turn, Clyde.
And we all know, right? More and more women.
Right turn, Clyde.
Right turn, Claudia. More and more women are taking that right turn. They have more and more women have gender fatigue. They don't see feminism as a progress. They see it as a polarizing issue where more and more young women are distancing themselves from feminism. However, they still are in the equity trap where they think, right, by merely existing, they are entitled to all the benefits of the working man, all the uh, uh, trappings of a uh, bourgeois society while maintaining communist collective ideology. With so many conflicting ideologies held by feminists, the inevitable cultural and ideological backlash will tear each other apart. And you end up with the double shift, where feminists, without a man to take care of them, without cannot afford to lose their job. They cannot afford the lifestyle they want. They inevitably only marry to loot a husband, but eventually they run out of loot and they run out of husbands to loot. And that looting cycle is not yet slowing down, but eventually it will. The government is already panicking. We have the activists like the marriage activists like Match Walsh and who Focon, and you have the neoliberal all pushing marriage, where feminism was anti-marriage, is now becoming pro-marriage, where they're creating it as a requirement that men have to marry a woman and take care of all her needs. And basically, they are creating a slave class out of men. That you have the Matt Walshes, the Joe Piazzanis of this world, who basically want men to be a slave class. Right? This whole idea of equity, wage equalization payments, where a secretary can earn as much as a fireman. Why? You don't do anywhere near the work. You don't even work the same hours. You don't have the same work requirements. You don't have the same work expenses. You don't have the danger. And we do not see feminists saying, well, male models should be paid as much as Claudia Schiffer or Tina Wing or even look, even when someone does, like Dylan Mulvaney, whether you like him or not, whether you believe he's a man or a woman, you've got to admit, feminists got upset when he got paid as much as a woman to be on the cover of Vogue. This is the problem, isn't it? When they hit equality, they hate it. They don't want solutions. They want a never-ending crisis. Now we do. Now often it is more and more that we are all becoming aware that feminism was created by the Rockefellers. Well, not just the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Rothschilds, right? The richest families in the world have these big meetings and have been having them long before Davros. What were all these bankers doing on the Titanic? Why they were coming back to New York? So that means most of America's bankers have been in London having a big meeting. People are so observant in that they see the results, But they're not so critically thinking yet to go, wait a minute, what were they doing there in the first place? They were creating the new economic order. And in order to bring out the new economic order, they had to get rid of the traditional man, the strong man. So every time you hear about the new world order, understand they are building to a war to get rid of us. Right? You keep hearing about the disappearing white man and the women cheering it on. This is what happens leading to war. This is why they create a detachment between man and woman. So there's no opposition to war. So there's no opposition to killing us off because they see us as the enemy. They don't see Russia as the enemy or China as the enemy. They see man as the enemy. So they're happy for Ukraine and Russia to kill each other. And they want more killing. If you've seen my war videos, you'll understand. And then, of course, you get into the other side of the equation where now women, right? They said, oh, Iran's a feminist revolution. Yet the vast majority of protesters are increasingly men who realize that they are victims. And it's increasingly aware that this is a freedom from Islam revolution, which is why you're not hearing about Iran anymore. And I can't. I think covering Iran will be just as disastrous, if not worse, than trying to cover. There's just too many variables, and too many people who have access to far better footage. Yeah, and then we just get further and further away from red pill and more important long-term issues. This is what happens, right? And this is the danger of feminism and any other movement, is that if you do not have an end goal, right? Now, many scholars believe that feminism never had an end goal, right? At least when it was just asking for the vote, it had an end goal. But feminists got a taste of power. But it was always meant to be that feminism was a bourgeois luxury of the wives and daughters of the rich men, the politicians who ran the G7. Now, they didn't call it the G7 then publicly, but it was always, right, since the rise of neoliberal capitalism in the Industrial Revolution, there has been a G7. United States, Britain, Italy, Canada, France, Germany, Russia, they used to all, and Japan, used to all meet, right? The bankers have, since the was it the French? I think it was the French, the collapse of the French bank. Since then, bankers have been meeting to make sure that banks don't collapse. And theorists believe that feminism is basically to keep the flow of money so banks can keep siphoning off money. That they make no money on savings. They make money off siphoning off money to themselves, using that siphoned money to create assets to basically so they can pay themselves lots of money in the bank. So like banks, most of the assets held by banks don't make money for the depositors. They make money for the banks. Feminism is about destroying the fundamentals of a free market. That's the free exchange of goods and services between citizens. Right? They want to create a neoliberal capitalist world where these huge mega monopolies, like you have DuPont, you have competition between DuPont, Torbans, and others to control paint, to control color. You have right now a competition between OpenAI, ChatGPT, and Grok. You have all these companies all trying to jostle and push each other out of the marketplace with a race to the bottom in pricing. You have car companies. China is trying to destroy the entire car industry around the world with hyper-competitive pricing on products that are far inferior to Western cars, but you just can't afford. The Western man was lured into a trap to ever increase his wages. And if you ever studied economics, you'll actually understand, right? In Asia, particularly in China, inflation has always been less than 1%, while the West has run at anywhere from 2.5 to 4% annually depending on the country. So the wage gap, the price gap, just grew so different. And like you go from 1980 through to 2000s, as companies got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the number of executives shrunk, the wages of executives became exorbitant. And they justified this by saying the increased responsibility. But this created, but believe it or not, it wasn't men who drove up. After the 90s, it was women. And some now believe it was always women. The women, and I'm not saying that women are a net negative in society, but women have always been consumers and gatherers, right? Right. If you remember back to early history or biology or any, right, hunter gatherers is a term that we hear often, but we never hear about the third option. Right? There's a hunter, there's a gatherer, but the third option, the parasite, the grifter, right? The Andrew Tates of the world are neither hunters nor gatherers. They are both. They're the exploitative class, right? The people who are strong, confident, they know how to acquire and hold resources, but they also know how to take resources. They know how to find, they know how to appeal. And the rise of the influencer, particularly feminist influencers, you see ever and ever the greater growing hypocrisy of feminist influencers who are behind the scenes mostly sex objects for rich men, right? Most feminist influencers are sex objects of rich men. And once they hit the wall and no longer physically attractive, they turn from physical sex object into a tool where they are now the activist who goes out and manipulates the market. Whether it's Jeff Bezos flicking half his fortune to McKinsey because the general belief is that it was her side of that when he was creating his business, that it was her side of the family that brought the money, the subsidies, the contacts, and of course the political funding, and the general belief that institutions were buying books en masse through Amazon to grow the business, as well as the investors, right? The investors who bought into Amazon on the belief that Amazon would one day become this monolithic monopoly. By the way, Amazon is in its third round of firings just this week alone of executives. The company cannot make a profit, so they are trying to again shed workers, and this time they're going after executives, which they should have done 20 years ago. But the company was so bloated, full of DEI hires and all these other things, that they are now looking at definitely having to relocate more and more businesses out of blue states, even their warehouses. Again, feminism for the kill, literally. Right? Ever since the breakup, the Amazon has been increasingly in trouble, which increasingly points to the fact that feminism and activist groups and were funded by US aid. Because isn't it amazing? It's about the time where aid spending started to decrease, and then all of a sudden, particularly you notice more and more, right? After Biden, there was after Trump's first term, there was a brief resurgence in all this buying, and then it suddenly cut off again. Why? Because Trump. So definitely, every time Republicans are in power, these activist groups get setbacks with government cuts. But people will point to Obama and say, well, Obama made cuts. Yeah, but those were different. If you notice, Obama's cuts tend to uh, help monopolize the car industry, get rid of male jobs like the lumberjack, drove a lot of people out of America into Canada to work in the forest oil industry. There are lots of shifts going on every day that is so complex a web that feminists didn't see their own trap coming, right? And they still, because critical analysis would have them question their own beliefs, but because it's a cult and of course the key critical factor the difference between a religious and a cult is where a fundamental philosophical belief has worship. But so you have a philosophy, a religion, and a cult. Philosophies don't have worship. Religions have worship, so do cults. But cults, first and foremost, you cannot question the narrative. So increasingly, feminism is a cult where you have worship of the gyno goddess, you have environmental undertones, you have neo-paganism, neo-liberalism. Liberalism is, of course, the itself is a cult of the worship of of a trinity of evil powers. But most cults, they masquerade as an ideology. Same with politics. Most politics masquerades as ideology, when in fact they are cults. Where the first thing that gives sign, there are many signs for a cult, but the first sign of a cult is thou shalt not question the beliefs, whether it's economic, ecological, uh, sociological, faith-based, or politically based. Now, politics is usually fundamentally hooked to economics. But the three main traps in this world that we have to worry about is economics, our personal freedom, and our cultural beliefs. And feminism exists to undermine our cultural beliefs, undermine our happiness and our rights, to turn us all into wage slaves, and of course, fundamentally, that the so-called idea of cultural liberation. Well, you cannot liberate, right? You cannot exist without food. Right? You have to clean your clothes. You have to clean your body. Right? You have to clean like owning a car. Right? You have to clean it. Oh, you own a body. You have to take care of it. Women increasingly just cannot work out the fundamentals, right? So they can't reconcile their beliefs. All they want is more freedom. Yet, actually, it ends up the opposite direction. More, right? They're slaves to their ideology. More and more they're protesting. More and more they're working two jobs. More and more women are falling behind the 8 ball, where they become indebted, bankrupted. They can't find jobs for their they can't pay their they're increasingly educated, but increasingly cannot pay for their education, and increasingly can't find works in their field. Why? Because there are just too many teachers already. There are too many people with gender studies, human resources. There are just not enough corporations anymore, right? And as the number of corporations decrease, there are going to be even less jobs, right? And then, of course, you get to AI, which can replace human resources, which can replace a lot of your customer service. Already, moderators, YouTube moderators, I think they're down to 500 apparently. And of course, you have now Amazon shedding executive works and replacing them with AI because they're not profitable, right? All these departments made Amazon unprofitable. They did this on purpose because they were subsidized. They were able to manipulate the market and destroy tens of thousands of companies over 20 years because they were subsidized. Without those subsidies, Amazon would still be a bookstore. We know this to be true. Everybody knows it to be true, right? Ebooks were not profitable, right? Because of the massive cost of computing, the massive cost of just the warehousing electricity for physical books, sent borders broke, but equally, you still have those big warehouses full of computers, right? Without the subsidies, Amazon is gone, right? All these big contracts to Amazon were arbitrary. They weren't based on any market forces. They were an arbitrary amount that Obama just said, how much do you need a year? And they just wrote it and gave it to them. So inclusivity, feminism is a robbery, right? A wealth transfer mechanism that has trapped its actual participants increasingly in the same slavery they intended for men, where they expected men to be so desperate for women that they would take care of women even if in an abusive relationship. Now, I don't know if it's always been this way. I cannot speak for previous generations, but it's definitely boomers were in abusive relationships. And increasingly, boomers have transferred their trauma, their psychological issues, their inability to critically think, because they fundamentally have not passed on the same amount of education they received because they felt it was harmful, toxic, created misogyny, misandry, or whatever the ism, and they talk about Islamophobia, sexism, racism, but they never talk about Anglophobia or misandry. But increasingly, yes, and we've seen this in the rise through the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century of Romanticism. And this is based on the Roman Republic, where cultural identities would be stripped away to their lowest common denominator and Romanized, and to create because Rome was the first New World Order, right? It's sometimes portrayed as the first liberal empire, right? Because Greek, even though Greece is the birth of liberalism, most things are neoliberal. When the neoliberal movement comes out of Rome, and the Rome was the first republic, whereas Greece failed and was taken over by Rome. So increasingly, feminism is a trap for women, and increasingly, the solution is, just like men, to walk away. No, I'm not saying that you have to stop being mgtow. I'm just giving you the facts for you to decide what you do with them, and how you live your life is up to you, right? You go your own way. Now, since the chat is idle, I will leave it here. Hopefully, one day there'll be enough of you watching and chatting to get a panel going, or I'll have to change times. I don't know. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. Please support the channel and support me on Ko-Fi, Patreon, buy my books, buy my links in the link tree description below, or scan the QR code on the screen. See you in the next video, and bye for now.